Good evening. My name is Mark Barnekow, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Yuen Campus in Hong Kong, our premier location in Asia, representing UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. Welcome to the UChicago Focus series. We're sharing tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Yuen Campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so by first registering on Zoom and submitting your questions there. I also encourage you to visit the website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest news and information, or you can also follow us on UChicago Yuen Campus social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. It's our great pleasure tonight to have invited Professor Kenneth Pomeranz, the newly appointed faculty director of the Yuen Campus in Hong Kong. Professor Pomeranz will share his knowledge of the history of UChicago's presence in Hong Kong and Asia, tell stories of challenges he encountered while researching the history of our heritage site on Mount Davis, and provide a vision for the Yuen Campus academic involvement in Hong Kong and East Asia in the future. Professor Kenneth Pomeranz is a distinguished university professor of modern Chinese history and in the college. University professors at the University of Chicago are selected for internationally recognized eminence in their fields, as well as for their potential for high impact across the university. Only 23 members of the University of Chicago faculty have received this high honor, and today only 10 faculty members hold the University of Professor title. Professor Pomeranz's work focuses mostly on China, and he's also very interested in comparative and world history. Most of his research is in social, economic, and environmental history, and he's also worked on state formation, imperialism, religion, gender, and other topics. Some of Professor Pomeranz's award-winning publications include The Great Divergence, China, Europe, and the Making of the Modern World Economy, The Making of a Hinterland, State, Society, and Economy in Inland Northern China, 1853 to 1937, and The World That Trade Created. He's also edited or co-edited 5 books and was one of the founding editors of the Journal of Global History. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, American Council of Learned Societies, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. His current projects include a history of the Chinese political economy from the 17th century to the present, and a book called Why is China So Big?, which tries to explain from various perspectives how and why contemporary China's huge landmass and population have wound up forming a single political unit. Welcome, Ken. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to begin by showing a 30-second clip of our campus for those audience members who may not have visited yet, to put this evening's program in perspective, and then we'll come back to you for our conversation. That's a great way to get us started this evening. And Ken, I'd like to start the evening by having you talk a little bit about the history of UChicago in Asia and specifically in China. We've had a long history here that not a lot of people may be familiar with.
Hey, thanks, Mark. So the history goes back almost to the founding of the university, though not quite. But it was also a history for a long time that had a lot of fits and starts to it. So the university dates, as you all, or as many of you know, from the 1890s. And as early as 1904, there was an interest in creating actually a campus in China Originally, the idea was to put it under the divinity school, and it was going to be connected to missionary work. That plan, for a number of reasons, didn't go anywhere. But it testifies to the very early interest of the university in having a presence in China. And for much of the pre-war period, I would say our most important presence was, that we trained a lot of important Chinese. So, for instance, Gan Naiguang, the guy who more or less devised the administrative structure of the nationalist government in the 30s, was trained at the public administration program at University of Chicago. A number of China's major scientists were trained here. And we also had a faculty presence going to Asia. Perhaps the most noteworthy of the early people was a man named Hurley Creel, a philosopher and historian who started going to China in the late teens already, and remained a professor at the university into the 1960s. One of my kind of little stories, he wrote, among other things, a very important book on Confucius. One of my favorite stories about him is that while he was in China, he collected a lot of what he believed to be Chinese antiquities, knowing that some of them were authentic and some of them weren't, but he picked them up when he could. And apparently when he came back to the States, he used these things as gifts for people. And actually just about 2 years ago, I got a call from somebody who said, we have this thing that we think might be an ancient Chinese bronze, but we're not really sure. And the legend in my family is that during the Depression, my grandpa painted the house for Hurley Creel, and Creel was short of cash and gave me this bronze, or gave Grandpa this bronze. And we don't know if what we have is really valuable or not. Do you have anybody on the faculty who could help us authenticate it? We had to tell it to go to a private art dealer because it was not in the precise expertise of any of us. But it's a sort of little symbol of the way in which those early connections live on. But of course, after 49, with the freeze in US-China relations for many years, we didn't have much in China. And then in more recent years, as part of the university's internationalization, we began to pursue a presence in China again. It started obviously with students and faculty going back. And then in the 90s, when the university pared back the core curriculum a little bit, it became easier for students to do study abroad because they didn't have as many Hyde Park requirements that conflicted with time away. There was a big ramping up in international programs in the late 90s. And then in the 2000s, we began to have a presence in China specifically. First, the Beijing Center, then the Hong Kong Center. The Hong Kong campus actually began, as we'll maybe talk about a little bit later, began with the Booth School, but rapidly became a campus for the entire university. And that's really where we are today.
Yes, and so before you became faculty director, you'd long been involved in getting this Yuen Campus here in Hong Kong on Mount Davis up and running. And so you mentioned the transition from Booth, which, my involvement, with the Booth School, there was a decision made in the 2000s, late 2000s, to move the campus from Singapore to Hong Kong. And then you got involved, and maybe you could tell us what year you got involved, to actually start to peel back the layers on the history of this site once Francis and Rose Yuen helped us to locate it with some other alumni. Maybe you can pick up the story from there.
Okay, so I really became involved in late 2013. And at this point, the university, well, we had started in Hong Kong in rented space. And then in large part, thanks to the generosity of the Yuens and other alumni, we were able to contemplate building a permanent site. And we had contracted for a piece of land in, for those of you who haven't been there, just a spectacular space, which turned out to be a historic site. And part of our commitment in the lease for the land was that we had to build, well, we had to preserve as much of the historic architecture as we could, which is a story in itself. And we also were obligated to create a small museum and a series of both permanent and rotating exhibits that would document the history of the site in relationship to Hong Kong and to the world more generally. And I was on the oversight board, and that's where I, as a historian, got involved and said, you know, we should really, rather than contracting this out to some firm that does historic restoration, you know, we can work with such a firm, but we should really take the research in-house. This is what we do. And they said, congratulations, you're in charge. So that's where I got involved. And the history of the site turns out to be complicated and fascinating. And there's actually a lot we still don't know about it. One of the reasons that there's a lot we don't know about it, which I discovered soon into my research, is that when the British left Hong Kong in 1997, they took with them a very large portion of the records that were in the Public Records Office in Hong Kong. They took them back to Britain. And my first thought was, oh, great, that means they're sitting in the National Archives in London. That's a very, very professional archive. It has great online access. It has all sorts of things. This is going to be relatively easy. And then I started doing searches and discovering that nothing would come back for topics on which you knew there had to be documents. You would put in 1967 Hong Kong riots, absolute nothing. A little bit more digging turned out that, so the documents had been repatriated to Britain under the terms of the British Freedom of Information Act. They were supposed to have been put in the archives and made public, and they never had been. We don't know exactly why, but huge numbers of documents, not just from Hong Kong, but from what used to be called the Foreign and Colonial Office and is now called the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, had just been shoved in a basement and never properly archived. In fact, the way this came to light was a group of elderly Kenyans were suing for what they said was mistreatment during the suppression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya in the 50s. And the government claimed to have no documents about this. And then by odd chance, the plaintiffs found a carbon copy of such a document in the personnel file of one of the British officers. They said, aha, if this is a carbon copy, there has to be an original. One thing led to another. There was a lawsuit, there was a settlement, there was an investigation in which it came out that at least 600,000 files, and my rough guess is that that's 20 million pages of documents, give or take, had been just stuck in a basement and not archived. Of that, those 600,000 files, we now know that 260-something thousand of them relate to Hong Kong. That's probably about 8 million pages of documents. The British government has pledged that eventually those will be made publicly available. But as we all know, eventually is one of those funny words. And in the meantime, it's more or less impossible to get access to them. So somewhere out there, there are a lot of stories that have yet to be told, but we did what we could to piece together the story with the sources we did have, newspapers, books, magazines, talking to people in Hong Kong, talking to people who had been in Hong Kong, other government archives.
Was there much in the way of a repository here locally in Hong Kong that you were able to access at one of the universities or in the local municipal museums?
So there was a little bit of stuff at HKU, including a couple of really terrific videos, very rare videos, showing footage of what eventually became our campus site during the Battle of Hong Kong, during the Japanese invasion. And so you can actually see Japanese planes dropping bombs on Mount Davis, where the British had some very large guns that were giving the Japanese trouble. They also have a collection at HKU of oral histories relating to the 1967 riots, which include a couple from people who were held at a detention center on our site, and a lot of general interest stuff. The Hong Kong History Museum had some interesting material, including especially for the material culture. So our site was a British military base for a while. The museum was of great help to us in figuring out, what was a soldier of that time dressed in? What did their equipment look like? Things like that. They also have a great collection of photos, which had some really good stuff. For actual written documents, we mostly had to look elsewhere. We found things in funny places. So the site was a detention center for a while where the British held people who had not been convicted, but whom the British suspected of various things. And that site was visited by a Red Cross delegation to inspect the facility to see if it was sufficiently humane. The records for that turned out to be in Geneva, where the International Red Cross has its records. I thought for a minute I might get a free trip to Geneva out of the deal, but turned out the more efficient thing was to contact a friend of mine who taught in Geneva and hire one of his graduate students to go take photos of the archive for us. So we found stuff in strange places, but that's part of doing research on a place that is linked to the world. You find stuff popping up in Sydney, Australia, in London, in Chicago itself, you name it.
What is your sense of the documents that the British are holding, that in terms of what kind of light those documents might shed on this location, on this specific site?
It's very hard to know for sure, and of course, as with all government repositories, probably the vast majority of the records are actually pretty routine and mundane. But we do know that there were some pretty important incidents that happened right on our site. So in 1950, for instance, there were a group of defeated nationalist soldiers who had fled to Hong Kong, who happened to camp out right on the site where our campus is now. And they got into a fight with a group of pro-communist union members on the day of the Dragon Boat Festival in 1950, which happened also to be about a week before the Korean War broke out, and then a week later, the British government cleared them off the hill and moved them to a place called Rennie's Mill, which then became sort of Little Taipei for the next 40 years until it was torn down to make way for high rises. There has to be British government records of that. We know that there was a group of Royal Engineers who were based on our site in the in the 1950s, who played a role in a whole bunch of construction projects in the 50s when Hong Kong was growing extremely rapidly and the infrastructure really couldn't keep up. But we don't know exactly what projects they worked on. And we don't know the sort of details of those projects. And then we know that when the site was a detention center, it held some very interesting folks at various points. So the highest ranking spy that we know about in the history of Hong Kong, a man named Zhang Xiaofo, or John Zhang, if you use his English name, who rose to be deputy director of the Hong Kong police force and was in fact a mainland agent. He was arrested in 62, maybe it was 63, and was held on our site until he was essentially deported to the mainland. Another man, Mandarin name is Chen Jianjian, who was held, the British later admitted, by mistake on suspicion of being a Taiwanese agent in early 62, was held for 2 weeks, and then was a key figure in a pretty spectacular lawsuit where he accused the British of all sorts of torture at the site. And there was a libel suit because the British officials said we did no such thing. In fact, that was when many people in Hong Kong first learned that our site was a detention center, because it had been secret up till then. In 67, during the riots, 53 people were held at the site for as long as 22 months under British emergency legislation. Some of them were pretty famous people. There was an important film star. There were a couple of significant journalists and educators. It became a big story. And then the last thing that we know about, though I assume that there's more. So in 1976, when the Japanese Crown Prince was about to visit Hong Kong, it would have been the 50th anniversary of his father's, 40th anniversary of his father's ascent to the throne. Some Japanese Red Army members were caught in what they claimed was a fishing boat off Hong Kong with a bunch of explosives in it. They were held at our site, and we lose the paper trail. We don't know what happened after that. And then after 1990, the site ceased to be a detention center, but it was converted into a site in which it was still held by the Hong Kong police, but it was now used by the Criminal Investigations Division as housing for people who were in the witness protection program. So people who were, for instance, preparing to testify against mobsters, and there was fear for their lives. They were held here. And there have to be really interesting stories connected to those, right? I mean, mob trials are always interesting, but we don't have any details. The connection runs out. And then there's all sorts of stuff that's kind of loosely affiliated with the site. So there were a bunch of squatter settlements on the edges of our site from the 40s all the way through the early 60s. There was one public housing development that was built not on our site, but very close to it, and complicated relations between the people there and the people on the in the British Royal Engineers barracks. There's all sorts of stuff like that. And then there's stuff that's more mundane, but probably really interesting, right? Just the detailed records of the construction. How did the connections for water, electricity, et cetera, work? How was the decision made that the housing project that was near us was a low rise, a series of cottages, rather than the high rises for which Hong Kong public housing became famous? Those would be really interesting things to know, and we won't know them for a while.
Were there any detainees still living when you were doing your research that you were able to interview and speak with?
So yes, so of the 53 of them, there were about a dozen who were still alive. A few did agree to talk to us. There's actually a recording of our interview with one of them that you can access through the campus website, a rather detailed one. And then one or two shorter ones. And then there are a couple who did not respond to requests for interviews, but we're still hoping that maybe, for instance, if we said to them, how's about if we record you and agree to archive it and hold it until your death? Would you talk to us on the condition that it wasn't released until afterwards? So we still have some hopes we'll get a couple more of them to talk to us. We also got physical stuff. So one of the people who was held here was an amateur artist of some skill, and he made art actually with material that his family smuggled to him. He used the pigment out of candy wrappers and things like that. And he is gone, but his son is alive and agreed to let us reproduce some of the art. Other people, children, talked to us and told us what they remembered of what their parents had told us of their time at the detention center. And I have to say, to the extent that we were able to cross-check those memories, they seem to have been remarkably accurate. You don't necessarily expect children's memories of what their parents told them of what happened 50 years ago to be on target. But to the extent that we were able to check, what they remembered of the details was right.
With that in mind, I'm just curious whether since you did your research on the site, and it seems to be an ongoing initiative on our part at University of Chicago, is there a way for people to get in touch with you or with us so that if they have information about this site that they're willing to share, that you can actually know about that information and include it in your...
I mean, I'd love to hear from anybody who has information or has artifacts. You can email me directly. You could email the Heritage Center at the Yuen Campus. We have some, I mentioned the public housing project that was adjacent to our campus. We have a wonderful set of photos that came to us from a man named Tony Lamb, who grew up in those projects, has since become an architect of some prominence, and gave us a bunch of his early family photos, plus a book he'd written remembering his days there. That was great stuff. Yes, we'd love to have anything that people have, or even if people just have things they have heard. I spent some time in the research tracing down rumors of things that happened on our site, which could not be confirmed at this time. So we didn't include them because if you don't know it's true, we don't want to say it. But there are all sorts of stories that circulate. Some of them probably true, some of them probably not. One of the more intriguing is a rumor that after Tiananmen, when British and American intelligence smuggled some Chinese dissidents out of China, we know that many of them did come through Hong Kong. And one story we have heard is that our site, which was by that time vacant, or at least not being used as a detention center anymore, but was still in control of the Hong Kong police, was used as a debriefing center, a place for them to kind of get used to, be prepared for their new lives. We have been unable to confirm that. But obviously, it would be really interesting to know if that's true or not.
And what about popular culture? Can you tell us a little bit about the movies that were made here and roughly what years those were made and any backstories and history there?
Okay, so in 1995, in preparation for the handover, the special branch of the Hong Kong police, which had owned this site, was disbanded. The site was essentially untenanted from 95 until UChicago took it over. But it was used for various things, including it was used as a site where some movies were made because it was empty. So if any of you have ever seen the movie Lust, Caution, which is a great film, actually, So the main action of the story takes place in Shanghai during the Second World War. The heroine is this glamorous woman who infiltrates the Japanese high command, but who maintains ties with her Chinese lover. She can't stand to leave him. And they meet in a secret house. That secret house is actually the warden's house from the detention center days. They needed a white building that was far away from any other buildings. And of course, in Hong Kong, it's not easy to find a building that's far away from any other buildings. So they used our site for that. Wong Kar-wai's 2046, which, as the name implies, is a futuristic movie, has a couple of scenes that were filmed on our site, though they disguised it so much you can't tell it's our site. It was also used in a bunch of much less famous movies, tourist promotion videos and things like that. There too, we're still finding out. So I mentioned that most government documents are routine. Probably somewhere in there are a bunch of film permits. And we would love to have them, just to know what was done here. But essentially the site had no permanent tenant and was in pretty bad shape when the Hong Kong government decided to lease it out, solicited bids, and made education one of the priority categories for potential users. And that's when UChicago, with the help of our alums, was lucky, and of the Hong Kong Jockey Club, I should say, was lucky enough to make a successful bid and turn what had been a very inward-looking site into an outward-looking site that we hope connects to the world.
One of our audience members has been a tour guide at our site and asked, apparently there were some British who came back to the site and had a tour on the site, and the audience member was wondering if you've ever had a chance to talk to any of the British, whether they were any of the commanders or the people stationed at the site, and interview them.
I have not. So we did manage to find a British soldier who had been stationed here in the 50s, who is still alive and in the UK. We made contact with him through, if I remember right, it was a British veterans Facebook group. And he seemed pretty interested in talking to us. And then he began to have health problems. And we kind of lost the trail. We should try to renew that, but we haven't yet. We have talked to some British people who had other kinds of connections to it. So I mentioned that the site was turned over to the Criminal Investigations Department of the Hong Kong Police as use for housing for people in the Witness Protection Program in the 90s. One of the key figures in running that program is still very much alive and is in fact involved with us. He's on our advisory board. And so we've obviously spoken to him at some length. When the British first started holding people here, it was under one set of rules of emergency legislation that gave them very, very broad powers to hold people without trial. Those rules were modified in the 1960s due to the efforts of a group of British barristers who wanted to expand civil liberties in the colony. One of those barristers, who is still alive, spoke to us about his role. So he wasn't directly involved with our site in the sense of having set foot on it, but the role he played in changing the rules for detention without trial had a lot of impact on our site because it changed the way they used it. So there have been things like that, but we've been a little bit frustrated in our hopes to find more people who had real, on-site experience living in the barracks, etc. Found a couple of children of such people, but we haven't had that much luck with direct people. One of our other archival initiatives, which in the nature of things will take a while, is my guess is that a lot of those disappeared British documents from the 50s and 60s, particularly the ones that had to do with security and with, for instance, surveilling communists during the 1967 riots, things like that. My guess is that the British government was probably copying the Americans on a lot of this. So I've launched Freedom of Information Act requests with the US government, hoping that copies of this stuff will turn up in the US. So far, I've found just a couple of not very exciting documents, but my hope is that somewhere in the bowels of the National Archives in Washington are CCs of a whole bunch of British memos. We'll just
Did you hear of any destruction of documents specifically, or were just missing documents in unavailable?
I have not heard specifically of any destruction of documents. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened, but I don't know of any. The hope is that an awful lot of it is still sitting out there. And the British, of course, did leave in a quite orderly fashion in 97. So the hope is that they did what they said they were going to do, which is to pack the stuff up in nice orderly boxes and send it to London, in which case someday it will come out of those boxes.
Great. You mentioned the Heritage Historical Direction and Advisory Board that you've been involved with probably since the early days. But in your new capacity as faculty director, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that role is about, what advisory boards and boards you're involved with. I know you're involved with Provost Awards. Could you share those things with the audience?
Sure. So the faculty director and the advisory board does a few things. One is we administer a set of grants funded from the Office of the Provost for research projects that involve the center, the campus. And those can be for conferences that take place on our site. They can be for research that involves the Hong Kong area and requires cooperation with a local institution or an extended visit from a Chicago faculty member or graduate student doing the research. So we fund everything from, for instance, a study on mental health services in Guangzhou that one of our faculty is doing in cooperation with one of the medical schools in Guangzhou, to conferences that just happen to be in Hong Kong because Hong Kong is such a convenient place for people from all over Asia to gather. So before COVID hit, if you were doing a conference on almost anything that had a lot of Asian participants, be they from China, from Japan, from Vietnam, wherever, Hong Kong was a perfect gathering place. We now have a spectacular conference site. And so we funded conferences on everything from law and human rights to ancient history to contagious diseases and new treatments, you name it. That all goes through the provost's funding and through our board. We also oversee what we think is already a pretty vigorous program, and we hope will be an even more vigorous program of public-facing events. Everything from the recent series on K-pop to stuff on, and we have an upcoming 2 panels on the Chinese real estate crisis, where we'll be gathering experts both from UChicago and from elsewhere to talk about what this means, both to China and to the larger world. But we mean it very much to be a center that's for the region, but is also connected. So I see my 2 priorities as, on the one hand, inReach. I want to strengthen connections to the Hyde Park campus and our other centers. There is all sorts of ways to do joint programming with Hyde Park. but also with, say, the Beijing and Delhi centers, or for that matter, the Paris Center. Right? We live in a global world. We should be doing more global programming. And if there's one thing that the pandemic has taught us, it's that with a Zoom connection, you can be as close to your colleagues 10 time zones away as you are to your colleagues down the block. And then the other thing is that we very much hope, and this is moving from in-reach to outreach, is we very much hope that this will be a place both for people throughout the region to hear what the University of Chicago has to say about a whole bunch of different topics and participate in those conversations, and for people outside of East Asia to learn about East Asia, not just Hong Kong, not just the Bay Area, but the whole region. Because again, Hong Kong has, from its founding, been embedded in this web of links that run to Singapore, that run obviously to the mainland, that run to Japan, that run to India, that run all over the world.
I know a lot of our audience members have asked the question, given the fact that we now operate under the national security law, what's the university's thought process about being in Hong Kong, staying in Hong Kong? Are we committed to Hong Kong? Maybe could you comment on that?
My understanding is that we are firmly committed to Hong Kong, right? This is a permanent campus. We're not in rented quarters. We're in a site we built. Through the Booth School, we actually offer degrees that come out of here, the Executive MBA, which, as you mentioned before, moved here from Singapore. We expect and hope to be in it for the long haul. Obviously, the current situation is fraught. The national security law does pose potential problems for free inquiry. The general state of US-China relations is right now pretty dismal, and that creates problems. But we are committed to a set of values, and we intend to try to live by those values and live by those values in Hong Kong. We will have to see how things develop. It's an ongoing process, I think, not only for us, but it's for everybody in Hong Kong. It's still figuring out what exactly does the national security law mean. Some things are clear, some things are much less clear.
And does that, one of the audience members asked about the role of American universities in Hong Kong. And this isn't specific to the national security law, but with US-China relations the way they are at the moment, the tensions, do we have a special role to play in your mind?
It does seem to be, and here I speak as an individual, not for the university as an institution, though I think there would be a lot of agreement that part of the role of universities should in fact be to help keep up human connections in difficult times, right? That governments are one thing, people are another. And loads of us at the university treasure our ties with Chinese colleagues. We have and enjoy working with Chinese students, and we believe that the things that those students can learn at University of Chicago are valuable to them regardless of their citizenship. We want to keep those ties up in difficult times. Likewise, we believe that to the extent that it is possible, we want to keep working with our Chinese collaborators. They are some of the leading scholars in the world in all sorts of fields. It would be a shame to see those relationships shrivel. Obviously, both they and we have to obey the laws of our respective countries. But one hopes that ongoing progress, be it in fighting disease or in figuring out what kinds of social policies can be effective for various problems, or in understanding astrophysics, whatever it may be. We hope that that progress can continue through a period of bad relations. It's certainly not the first period of bad relations between the United States and China, and we hope that it will be finite in length.
Great, thank you. One of our audience members is actually interested in asking more of an inward question, and that's what really UChicago Focus, this program, is all about. Their question is about the field of humanities at the UChicago Hong Kong campus and at the Chicago campus, and can you talk about the future of the humanities itself on both campuses?
Okay, let me just briefly say, because I should have actually said this earlier, one of the other things we do is we actually run courses at the Hong Kong campus, not only business school courses, but courses from the college. So students who are, for instance, taking the East Asian Civ survey before the pandemic had the option of doing 1/4 of that survey in residence in Hong Kong. And obviously you can add a kind of interesting dimension if you do it in Hong Kong, right? Lecture in the morning, field trip in the afternoon. It's just not possible in Hyde Park. We hope that we'll be going back to that again. We've run courses on a bunch of different things at the Hong Kong campus, and we hope to continue that. And some of them are things that are, again, have a specific Hong Kong related dimension, like East Asian Civ. Some of them aren't, right? So for instance, for historic reasons, we have for many, many years had ties through our Paris Center to astronomers in Paris, and we run astronomy courses from the Paris Center. There is no reason, and that has nothing to do with Paris's place in the universe. It's just, we have those ties. We hope to be deepening ties like that in Hong Kong as well. The humanities are obviously in a kind of tricky position right now, though I think they are in better shape at University of Chicago than at many, many campuses. And I mean, if I could just speak for a moment to history, which some people would say belongs in the humanities, some people would say belongs in the social sciences. After the 2008 financial crisis, there was this big drop-off in history majors. And the general perception, which I think was correct, was that a lot of this was people simply being scared about jobs and thinking, I better major in something practical. Well, the American Historical Association did some data crunching and found something pretty interesting, which is that if you correlate the majors of undergraduates with their post-college earnings, not surprisingly, if you look at the first job, students in fields like business or engineering are earning much more money a year or two after college than students who major in history or literature or something. But it turns out if you actually go 10 years out, which is more difficult data to get because as students change jobs, you often lose track of them. But if you do go 10 years out, the historians have caught up. And I think that's actually pretty powerful testimony to the fact that what we teach are a set of skills for analyzing complex human situations, for figuring out if you're in situation X at time 1, what do you need to know to have a good guess about likely outcomes at time 2? And those are really good skills to have, whether you're going to be a government official or a business executive or a whole lot of other things. And I think at a place like Chicago, part of it is that our students tend to come from somewhat better off backgrounds than the average. And so they feel a little bit more of a cushion, less pressure to be immediately practical. But I think it's also that we teach things like the humanities, both out of a faith that they are valuable in their own right, whether they make you money or not, but also out of a faith that in the long run, they're not impractical, that they're actually very good for teaching you how to navigate the world, how to figure out, okay, I have this document here. It says X. Should I trust that? Or is this a document that actually tells me more about the person that's writing it and his prejudices, his view of the world, than it tells me about the objective world that he claims to be analyzing? Or is it an awkward mix of both, right? That's what historians do when they look at a document. What is it telling me about the outside world? What is it telling me about the person who wrote it and the audience that found it convincing, even though I might know it was not true? And those are really useful skills to have, whether the document you're looking at is a real estate prospectus or a newspaper editorial or a book that claims to be telling you whether Facebook is good or bad for the world, or any one of 800 other things. I think the humanities teach skills that still matter and will always matter.
That's great. We have one audience member who was at the university from 72 to 74 as an undergrad economics major, who took courses from Hurley Creel, Edward Krakow, and Ping-Ti Ho. And he said during that time they had discovered important findings of Chinese history. And the question is, today, what are the main research interests of Chicago historians in China?
So there are a lot of different things, because obviously we do different sorts of stuff. Jakob Eiferth, who is mostly a post-49 PRC historian, is one of the leading people sort of piecing together the record of daily life, and especially rural daily life in the Maoist period. Jakob likes nothing better than to sort of cross-check documents with oral history, the memories of people out in the countryside. He spent a lot of time in places that most foreigners don't go, and has pieced together everything from women's experience of participation in textile production in the 60s, 70s, when there just wasn't nearly enough factory-made cloth for the needs of ordinary people out in the countryside. And so despite the fact that hand spinning and weaving were supposed to be gone, people were doing a ton of it. So that's at one edge. At the other edge, Don Harper worked with ancient medical texts, among other things, and has been piecing together a much more complicated and interesting picture of how Chinese medicine has evolved over time than we had before. I do sort of social, economic, and environmental history, mostly of the Qing, but I go backwards and forwards to some extent. So I've been looking at everything from trying to reconstruct agricultural yields in different parts of China to looking at patterns of deforestation to other things that are much less economic. I have a side interest in popular culture and have done some work on the history of the goddess of Taishan, who is now largely forgotten, particularly outside of China, because very few overseas Chinese are from Shandong, which is where her cult was centered. But in her day, she was as well known and popular as Guanyin and Tianhou. just huge. And so I'm interested in both, where does that popularity come from and why does it disappear? Johanna Ransmeyer is a legal historian. She did some fascinating work on, her first book is basically on unfree labor in the Qing Republic. So near the end of the dynasty, the Qing, wanting to conform to international law norms that came out of the abolitionist movement, legally abolished all kinds of unfree labor. But in fact, there were still, probably on the order of, I don't know, 3 to 5 million indentured people in China who had contracts ranging from 3 years to life, in which they were supposed to be working for a particular family. And those relationships didn't vanish overnight when they became illegal. Right? Families did not suddenly let their kids' nanny go, nor did the nanny necessarily have any place to go if they had let her go. And so Johanna has looked at the ways in which families strategized when the labor relationships they had created suddenly became illegal. So she's traced that story down through the Republic. And she's now interested in what she calls legal literacy. To what extent have people in China, both historically and in the present, known what the law was? How have they learned that? Is it more from popular culture? Is it more from official government proclamations? Is it word of mouth? And so she's very interested in sort of what people know about the law and whether they feel able to not merely protect themselves from it, but actually use it affirmatively to protect their interests, and how that's changed over time. Haven't even touched on the people in literature and performing arts, where we have a huge program. Judith Zeitlin has done really groundbreaking work on Chinese opera, for instance. So it's a pretty lively group, and it's a group that has certainly, our graduate student population has grown in numbers in the last decade or so quite significantly. And some of our grad students are doing just fabulous stuff. I mean, I look at what some of my students are doing and saying, gee, nobody thought of this when I was in grad school. And now it turns out not only are people thinking of it, they're finding ways to do it.
That's great. We have a little bit more time left, and we had some questions come in while you were talking. The same person that asked the question, who was a student at UChicago, wanted to let you know about a well-funded Hong Kong Chronicle Institute, funded at $50 million US, with the mission of compiling the Difangzhi for Hong Kong. It may be a 48-volume project. Wow. And the person is asking any advice that you have for those working on the project, or maybe you, Ken, would like to know more about that project.
I would love to know more about that project. So Difangzhi, or they're sometimes translated in English as gazetteers or local history, is a long-standing Chinese genre. In the old days, this would be something that the local elite compiled and presented to government officials, sort of, here's what you need to know about our county. And so it was obviously both an attempt to be an objective document that described everything from what are the county's products to who are its leading families to what interesting historical ruins do we have on site. And so they're very, very varied sorts of things. It was also obviously a political document, right? The list of leading families would also be a way of telling the local official, here are the people you better consult with before you do anything drastic. That tradition lapsed for a little while in the mid-20th century. And then starting really post-Mao, they began producing Difangzhi again, now through local government offices. And so some of those things are just fabulous sources of records. I don't know if this is planned in Hong Kong or not, but on the mainland, there's also a long series of documents called Wen Shi Ziliao. So literary and historical sources, I guess would be the best English translation. And these are sort of outtakes from the gazetteers. So things that, maybe in the process of learning who the leading historical figures to come from this county were, they may have required 50 pages worth of information about some guy. But because the gazetteer itself has to be finite in length, maybe only 3 paragraphs about him get into the actual gazetteer. The remaining 50 pages would often be published in these so-called Wen Shi Ziliao. And they range from, sort of my recollections of my time spent working with so-and-so to here are the local legends that are associated with this old cemetery to, this business that, was nationalized in 1956, let's say, if you're on the mainland, used to produce, was one of the most famous producers of pickles in the region. And we still have a bunch of their business records. I actually did an article early in my career based on exactly that. Because it turned out it told you a lot about late imperial business practices. So I hope that whoever is compiling this thing is thinking not just about the gazetteer, but about some equivalent to the Wen Shi Ziliao, a series of kind of outtakes, because those have been immensely valuable for people interested in local history of all sorts. And I assume these people know this, but it will also, given what Hong Kong is, they will need to cast their net broadly. Some of the people, they want to talk to a lot of people in Hong Kong and ask them if they have documents sitting around in their, in a back drawer somewhere. But they're also going to want to talk to people who are now in Vancouver, or who are now in London, or who are now in Guangzhou. It's a gargantuan effort. I wish them luck, and I'm really thrilled to know that it's underway.
That's great. We have one more question, and I'm going to tie this to maybe your closing of what your vision is now as the new faculty director for the Yuen Campus. Leading into that, the question is from a graduate student at the University of Chicago who would like to get involved in the Yuen Campus. Maybe you could share with them what you think they might be able to get involved with here, and then close us out with your vision for the campus.
Okay, so there are a lot of things. I mean, the simplest thing, of course, is just to make sure that you're getting the newsletter, attend some of the Zoom events. We hope that as we go back to normal and it becomes more possible to visit, you can use the campus as a kind of base of operations if you have research projects that would be facilitated by spending time in Hong Kong. We do, as I said, once COVID permits, we will again be teaching courses here in Hong Kong. Some of those courses will want teaching assistants. So I don't know what field this student is in, but if there is a course in their field that's going to be held in Hong Kong, it's a great opportunity for a graduate student. You come, you participate as the TA in the class in the morning, and then in the afternoon, you can go do your own work, whatever it may be, and take advantage of the fact that you're in Hong Kong. It's essentially, it's like getting extra research funding. And then also, if anybody is interested specifically in the heritage aspect of this, we do have ongoing projects and at least a little bit of money to support people who are willing to help us dig, because we do want to continue digging.
That's great. They didn't say what department they were in, but the other thing I wanted to mention, and we've had this over the last couple of summers, is internships for
Yes.
Students, particularly college students. And we probably would welcome graduate students as well if they were to want to maybe help you dig a little bit on the historical side and help us with some of the more day-to-day operational aspects of the campus.
Yeah, that would obviously be great. And just speaking for myself, I think it's, I talked before about how I think the humanities are not impractical. The flip side of that is that, I would like to see some of our graduate students do things with their PhDs other than teach. There are really useful ways that the skills that you've learned can be applied in other parts of the world. But if you want to do that, you're probably also going to have to persuade employers that you have some of the skills that PhD programs aren't that great at teaching. Collaborative work, for instance, is one of them, right? Especially in the humanities. The dissertation tends to be a pretty solitary pursuit. Nonprofits, businesses, et cetera, want to know that you're good on a team. Get some experience working on a team. See if you like it, see if you're good at it.
That's all great advice, Ken. And I'm really grateful that you could join us tonight. I'm really looking forward to working with you here on campus. You have a great vision for what we're going to be doing here academically and historically. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you'd like to learn more and visit our heritage site on Mount Davis, I did want to just mention that we do have a special heritage website. It's heritage.uchicago.hk. So please visit heritage.uchicago.hk if you're interested in the Heritage Information Center and the things that we're doing historically here on campus. Tonight, we also have a brief poll on tonight's program for the audience on Zoom. If you're watching us live on Facebook or YouTube, you can leave your answers in the comments below. And while you complete the survey, let me share more information about our upcoming programs this fall. Obviously, Ken just mentioned that he's going to be doing a couple programs on the China real estate market, which I'm really excited about. There'll also be a program with UChicago's Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies. The programs will be focused on storytelling, and there'll be another one on writing. So I'm really excited about those programs and collaborating with the Graham School as well. In addition, Ken's programs on the real estate market will be under a new series, bannered series, focused on the Greater Bay Area. So watch for some of those programs in the coming months. And make sure to follow our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Yuen Campus website, as Ken mentioned, for further information. Thanks a lot for joining us. Please stay safe and have a wonderful evening.